You can publish your orchestration as a WCF service to separate the WCF service logic from the business process logic. Before publishing your orchestration as a WCF service, you need to build the project that contains your orchestration. You can then use Biztalk WCF Service Publishing Wizard to publish the orchestration as a WCF service. This wizard helps you create WCF services. To create a WCF service, you need to ensure that the Service Endpoint option is selected. Selecting this option helps you select the Biztalk Server 2009 orchestration that you want to publish as a WCF service. You can then select the Enable Metadata Endpoint checkbox to indicate that the HTTP GetEnabled attribute of the service metadata element is set to true. Next, you select the Create Biztalk Receive Locations in the following application checkbox and specify the application that contains the orchestration. You then ensure that the Publish Biztalk Orchestrations as WCF Service option is selected. Now specify the Biztalk Server 2009 assembly file that contains the orchestrations. Ensure that all the dependent assemblies are in the same folder as the assembly file. You then select the orchestrations and the ports that you want to export. You can merge all the selected ports into a single WCF service. Next, you specify the target namespace for the WCF service. After specifying the target namespace, you specify the location to create the WCF service. You can choose to allow anonymous access to the WCF service. Finally, you create the WCF service. All the files required for the WCF service are created. BPM is a management approach that helps an organization align internal processes and automate them. Using BPM, organizations can optimize their business processes, structure activities, and produce services and products that meet their business requirements. To understand this concept, consider a company that maintains inventory by using supply chain methods, such as bulk purchasing if inventory falls below a certain level, purchasing expensive goods based on demand, and selling goods on consignment basis. When an order is processed by the sales system of the company, it leads to procurement of new goods in inventory. The company needs to identify the supply chain method for procurement of new goods. Considering the business requirements of the company, you can design a solution that includes order processor, order manager, and the business process itself. Order processor receives orders from the back-end inventory system and sends the orders to order manager. Order manager runs the processing stages in a sequence to process the order. You can use an orchestration to define the flow of orders through other orchestrations that implement the business process. You can further split the business process into components, such as the service interface, translators, the process manager, and the processing stages. These components can then be translated into patterns. The service interface facilitates communication between the inventory system, order processor, and order manager. The translator receives messages from the service interface, transforms the messages, and sends them to the process manager. The process manager controls the processing stages in the solution. In a well-designed BPM solution, you can include additional stages or remove existing stages from the process without reconstructing the entire application. In this solution, you can split the order process into multiple independent processing stages. The process manager can identify the processing stage that should handle the message. Each processing stage can then use an appropriate filter to process the messages. In this approach, the process manager does not have to maintain routing information. You can define routing information by adding a stage that sends and receives messages using the correct ports and filters. To define the format of an incoming message to be sent to the message broker, you first need to generate a schema for the incoming message. When generating a schema, you can choose the schema template. To generate a schema from an XML file, you select the Generate Schemas template. You then specify the type and location of the input file for which you want to generate the schema. The new schema is displayed in Solution Explorer under the project. You can specify a target namespace property for the schema and save the configurations. Next, to associate the fields between this schema and the destination schema, you need to create a map. To create a map, you select the Map template. You then specify a suitable name for the map and add the map to your project. The new map is added to your project and displayed in Biztalk Mapper. Next, open the source schema. The Biztalk Type Picker dialog box helps you select schemas from your project. You then open the destination schema and select the required schema from the project. Expand the source schema to view the child record nodes. Similarly, you expand the destination schema. Next, you create a link between the fields in the source and destination schemas. Depending on your requirements, you can connect multiple fields in the source schema to multiple fields in the destination schema. After creating the map, you must save all configurations. You then deploy the project to move to the next step in the process. You can use Biztalk Server 2009 Administration Console to create and configure the receive port for the incoming message. In Biztalk Server 2009 Administration Console, you select the application and create a receive port to receive messages. You can then specify a suitable name for the receive port and define a suitable receive location. To define a receive location, you specify a suitable name for the receive location and select an appropriate transport type. Next, you configure the transport properties for the receive location. In the Transport Properties dialog box, specify a receive location and select the receive pipeline for the receive location. Notice that the new receive location is added to the list of receive locations. After you configure the receive location, you specify the inbound map for transforming the incoming message to the required format. To define the format of the message to be sent from the message broker, you need to first create a send port. When creating a send port, select the appropriate port type to send the message. Next, you specify a suitable name for the send port and select an appropriate transport type. You then configure the transport properties to specify the destination of the message. You can specify a filter criterion for the outgoing message. The filter criterion includes the filter property, a comparison operator, and a value for which the filter property is evaluated. You can use the Group By property to add multiple filters based on your requirements. After creating a filter, you need to start the send port to use the filter. You can develop an itinerary and design its mediation flow by using Itinerary Designer. Toolbox in Itinerary Designer contains various shapes or elements that help you represent different actions or key abstractions. You can easily add elements from Toolbox to the design surface of Itinerary Designer. These elements represent the steps that need to be followed to process a message. After you create the mediation flow, you need to specify the properties, such as a connection string, to connect to the Biztalk2009 management database and model exporter configuration. The off-ramp and on-ramp elements are used to send and receive messages respectively. You need to associate these elements with the corresponding technology extender to bind off-ramp elements with physical send ports and on-ramp elements with physical receive locations. You also need to associate itinerary services model elements with extenders and set properties for an extender depending on the technology used. These properties may depend on the itinerary mediation services or the runtime artifacts of BizTalk Server 2009. You then identify the elements that need to be referenced as itinerary mediation services and create references for these elements. Next, you need to verify the resolver settings with the BizTalk ESB Toolkit 2.0 runtime configuration. To validate the settings, You invoke the Resolver service from the design surface of Itinerary Designer. You can then use an exporter included in Biztalk ESB Toolkit 2.0 to validate and export the itinerary runtime policy. Biztalk ESB Toolkit 2.0 includes two exporters, the file exporter and the database exporter. You can also implement a custom exporter. Finally, you can use the BizUnit framework or any other test client application to test your itinerary. You can implement patterns by using itineraries. To create an itinerary, you need to open the Add New Itinerary dialog box. The Itinerary DSL template helps you create itineraries. You can select the template, specify a suitable name for the itinerary, and add the itinerary to your project. Notice that the itinerary is displayed in Solution Explorer under the project. Itinerary Designer appears on the left. You can then configure the properties for the itinerary. For example, you can configure the Model Exporter settings to export the itinerary as an XML file to a local file location. You can later use this file to test your itinerary. After creating the itinerary, you define the structure of the itinerary. To define the structure, you need to first add model elements to it. For example, let's create an itinerary to route messages to multiple recipients. To do this, you add the on-ramp model element from Toolbox to the design surface of Itinerary Designer. You then specify a suitable name for the model element and configure its properties. You can add multiple model elements to meet your requirements. For example, drag the Itinerary Service model element from the toolbox to the design surface of Itinerary Designer. Specify a suitable name for the element and configure its properties. The Itinerary Service model element helps you define where the process will occur. The process may occur in a pipeline or in an orchestration. Now add a resolver to the Itinerary Service model element. The resolver associated with Itinerary Service model element identifies the recipient of the message based on the message content. Resolvers can retrieve the routing information and accordingly route messages. Resolvers are also responsible for how ESB services are executed. You can add multiple resolvers to meet your requirements and configure their properties. Next, you need to connect the model elements. This defines the flow of the itinerary. You can use Connector from Toolbox to specify the flow. Adding multiple elements, configuring their properties, and connecting them helps you determine the structure of the itinerary. For example, add an off-ramp model element to your itinerary to specify a send port. After adding the off-ramp model element, specify a suitable name for the element and configure its properties. For example, you can configure extender settings for the off-ramp model element. The extender settings of the off-ramp model element contain send handlers that process the message in the send pipeline. Now add another Itinerary Service model element. Specify a suitable name for it and configure its properties. You then connect both the Itinerary Service model elements. After connecting these elements, you associate the off-ramp model element with the required Itinerary Service model element to send messages. You have created an itinerary with two static resolvers to route messages to multiple recipients.